I think, or turn on his media. I don't know. Yeah. Oh, there's his microphone. Speak, Paul.
Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
There we go.
See
Excellent.
if I can get these microphones to work.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay, a microphone. I'm still having trouble with the microphones.
It's time to get started. Do you want to wait a minute or get going?
Let's see who we got here. So we got from the providers, we got Isaac and James and Eugene. See, we got nobody from MITRE. Interesting.
Yeah, I just got a message from Jim Malloy. He failed to register in advance and can't get approval in time. That's annoying, but it's okay.
Okay. We should have, we need a note taker. Would somebody like to volunteer to take notes? They don't have to be extra thorough. They don't have to be blow by blow. They mostly need to capture decisions made. Let's, we better go to the next slide and put the note well up while we're talking.
Absolutely. All right, I got to get to the slide panel. There we go.
It's kind of small, but I guess that's what it is.
I tried doing slide screen and it didn't like it. The sharing screen with slide presenter doesn't work well.
Yeah.
See if I can. I wonder if I can fix this. I'll work on see if I can get it bigger. That's better.
Yeah, that's better. Hopefully everybody's here. I don't see anybody who's a first timer, I don't think. If you haven't read Note Well, you should. It tells you what the rules are for participating. You shouldn't participate unless you agree to everything in the Note Well. So most people have done this before. So let's go on. Okay. Pretty simple agenda. We've got another version of the draft to sort through this time. I think Brian and I think we're close to done. We're hoping we can get to working group last call soon. Maybe that may determine that may be affected by what we hear today, if anything. There's been some discussion on the list since the last meeting. It's been helpful.
Yeah, it's been very helpful. I really appreciate everyone who's read the draft and spoke up and provided input. It's been very, very positive. Thank you.
Let's see. I'm not hearing any volunteers. Let's see. Is there anybody here I can draft?
Jonathan Lennox said he'll take notes.
I don't want to draft drop-ins.
Jonathan said he'll take notes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jonathan.
Appreciate it.
Ideally, we'd also have a jabber scribe. Let's see who's.
I'm in the jabber. It's all right. I can do that.
Okay. I'll take some notes too, just to make sure.
Right.
Okay, does anyone have anything they want to bring up regarding the agenda? If so, speak up now. I'm not
Okay.
hearing anybody. Okay, so I think we might as well. Here's Eugene.
Sorry. Do you want us to use
Gee-
raise hand in this meeting or just speak up?
Yes. You can just speak up given the small number of people in the room. I'm not really worried.
Okay. The only thing that I just wanted to ask about the agenda, I believe we would like to, talk about maybe some of the open issues that we had talked about on the email that maybe haven't been resolved, and perhaps bring up another couple. I guess your agenda is allowing for that, right?
Correct. I have a number of items that I think have not been resolved that I'm gonna talk about, and anyone else's. There will be time at the end for bringing up other issues. So yes, we will. We're definitely thinking we're going through the issues that are raised on the list, and anything else people want to talk about, we'll have time after that to work on them.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hey, Brian, this is Isaac with Source. Yeah. And can you share that list of issues? Just, it sounds like that's going to be our agenda then, right? You have a list. That
yeah. The slides are up on the meeting materials page, but I'll get to them. I'm going to switch. As soon as we agree that that's the only thing we have to do, I will switch slides and it shows you the issues that I've got. But the slides I'm going to present are in the meeting materials section.
Okay, I'll see if I can go find those. When I looked, I was only able to find the slides that you're showing right now.
Okay, they're there. They're there. Okay.
Okay, I'm not hearing anything else. We might as well move on.
All right, so let me switch.
Brian's switching hats from chair to author.
That's right. All right, so screen share, yes. Application window, draft RUM, share. All right. So here's where I think we are. There's still a bunch of confusion on outbound. There has been an ongoing discussion if Oauth has a role here, and we still have that open. There are a bunch of other small issues that Paul raised in an email that I haven't yet responded to, but I think I can satisfy him with the minor text changes. Don't think there's any substantive issues. I think we have dealt with the other issues that have been raised on the list, but I may have missed something, and this will go fairly quickly, and so I think we'll have lots of time to bring up other issues, and so I'm anticipating that I've probably forgotten something or not realized someone doesn't think that something I think is closed or settled is settled, and so we'll definitely have plenty of time after this to talk about things that aren't on that list. Okay, so outbound is basically the issues that are still around have to do with handling multiple proxies, both on inbound and outbound. The current question on the table, I believe, is what does multiple outbound proxies in the configuration mean? And then there's a follow-on for that, which is there's text in there that says devices should only accept incoming calls from entities they're provisioned with. And then how does that interact with outbound? So that whole issue is still kind of running around. the direction I think we're going is what Paul hinted at, which was outbound proxies. If there are multiple outbound proxies, inbounds are only allowed from those, and any of them can be, calls can go to any of the outbounds. Any of those can be used for inbounds. But I need to, first of all, is that right? Is that what people want to do? And then I'll need to modify the text to say that, so that if you have multiple outbound proxies, inbounds are allowed from any of them, outbounds must go to any of them. And presumably, well, let me stop there and ask if there's comments on that notion of basically going where Paul hinted, which is multiple outbound proxies means calls can go to any of them, but also any inbounds can go to any of them, which is what the outbound RFC says.
It was my issue, so let me try to clarify a little bit.
Sure.
We have the configuration of quote outbound proxies, specified. Yes. We also have listed that support of the outbound functionality. I forget the RFC number right now, but
yes,
it's a specific functionality is optional for the provider.
Correct.
Not optional for the RU.
Correct.
So I think if the provider is using outbound, then it's all clear, because the RFC for outbound specifies what multiple proxies are and what they do, and it's also clear, where your incoming messages come from, because it's all about connection reuse.
Right.
And so everything is fine in that case. The question arises if the provider is not supporting and using outbound functionality. We've still got proxies that can be configured. I think they're optional in total, aren't they? Correct.
The specification of proxies is optional in the config file.
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions. One, if there are no proxies configured,
yeah, how do you handle it? Right.
Yeah. Well, then how to connect is still well defined, as far as SIP is concerned. That's not an issue. But how or if you would restrict incoming calls isn't well defined at all.
Right.
And I don't think there's anything we can do in that case.
Well, let's. Why don't we just sort of stop and see whether this is really what we want to do? That is, you're suggesting, I think, that if you specify multiple proxies in the config, you must support outbound as a provider, because we don't know what multiple outbound proxies would mean in any other circumstance.
Yeah.
That what you're proposing?
Yeah. That's one.
Okay, so let's just try that. Do other participants think that that's reasonable? I mean, it doesn't say you have to support outbound unless it says that you only have to support outbound as a provider if you specify more than one proxy on the outbound configuration. And it's more common to have only one. Right, that's the more common circumstance, but multiple for redundancy purposes and other purposes is often helpful. But let's just ask the question: if we proposed it that way, if we said, if you specify more than one outbound proxy in the configuration, that means you must support the outbound RFC, and then we know what multiple outbound proxies mean. Is that a reasonable restriction? Anyone think that's a bad idea? I'm going to speak up if you think it's a bad idea, especially.
Ryan,
You are actually
you here?
confusing outbound and outbound here, Brian. The outbound RFC is a different thing than outbound proxies. So
I'm
you're
trying
mixing
to
apples and fruit
differentiate. I'm
baskets.
trying to say, yes, I'm trying to say, all right, so the configuration lets you specify one or more outbound proxies. And it says if you've got an outbound proxy configured, then all outbound calls go to that proxy. What does it mean if you have more than one outbound proxy configured? And
Well,
what?
Normally you configure a DNS name, and that DNS name leads to SRV records that can have multiple ones.
Yes, you can do.
But
Yeah,
SIP
yes.
outbound is a completely different package. That means that you have to have two open TCP flows to two different ingress proxies. So
Right.
the outbound RFC is a whole different thing than outbound proxies. As long as
Right.
you're aware of that, I'm fine.
Yes. Okay. Eugene?
Yeah, so just a question about the outbound proxy. I mean, I haven't read the outbound RFC, so I'm not real familiar, or I'm not familiar at all with that. But when you're talking about outbound proxy, are we just talking about where are the endpoints registering and
Not
how the call is?
registering.
No.
No, it's where calls are get sent. If you place a call, where does the call go? It's not registration.
Register, right?
It's after registration.
It's registration too, I think.
Well,
It's registration too, Brian.
I'm sorry. I apologize. Yes, you're correct. It is registration too.
It's just a way of overriding. If you have an address of record in example com, but you want all SIP messages to go to inbound.example.com in DNS, you configure an outbound URI to do that, to override and not use the address of record domain. So it's a simple configuration thing, and one shouldn't mix that with the outbound RFC, because the outbound RFC is also a different set of problems in different ways.
I think what Paul proposes is reasonable, though. There is a use for multiple outbound proxy URIs in the outbound RFC, and you can configure that, but that implies that you support the outbound RFC. If you only put one URI, if you only configure one outbound proxy, then you don't have to support the outbound RFC, and we know what that means.
I mean, you surely can have multiple outbound proxies configured without bothering at all with outbound RFCs.
And what does that mean? What does that imply on either
you have
end?
DNS SRV failover, or you select one. I mean, it's an implementation specific thing, right?
Well, we're trying to make sure that we have interoperable implementation. So we have to specify what the RU device assumes if the provider configures more than one outbound proxy and doesn't support the outbound RFC.
Well, you need to start looking at DNS SRV and say, if you don't use SRV and you configure multiple ones, you need a priority setting, or just allowing the RUM device to use a random setup and pick anyone, right?
I mean, we could define it that way, but I don't see any value in doing that. I mean, if that's what you want, you can just configure one and then use DNS to have multiple servers for it. And you've got all the mechanisms for priority and all that stuff there.
Yeah. So just say that the configured outbound has to be treated as any other CPUI. So we go to DNS resolution first, and unless we have DNS resolution, it's a host name, and then you have a single outbound server. But if you have DNS, you'll get the benefits of failover and load balancing.
I think we're tying ourselves in knots by terminology because we're using outbound in two ways. Maybe we should at least just start talking about RFC 5626 when we want to talk about that functionality. To distinguish it from the word outbound used for other purposes.
Yeah, I mean, you either talk about outbound proxy, right? Or the failover mechanism that we have in the SIP outbound standard, which means that you actually have two concurrent registrations for the same contact. And the service provider then have to do failover between those different reg IDs for the same contact, which very few carriers have, and we have never been able to test at SIPIT that it works properly. The only practical use of the SIP outbound RFC I see today is in SIP over WebSockets that is actually used, but only with one registration. But since the contact is useless, the reg ID is the only thing we have to be able to call back.
Well, does that suggest we just get rid of the outbound RFC? I mean, if nobody implements it, I'm not interested. But if it's useful, I think it's useful. I'm not sure. I thought it had more value than you're implying it does. We do use it in other circumstances.
It was a cool way to handle NAT, the NAT solution, but the implementation rate is almost zero. In my part of the world. I don't know about you, Paul, if you've seen it.
I don't have any visibility to
no.
The real world.
We implemented a server-side part of it in Camelio, and that took a lot of work. But we've never been able to test it at any SIPIT or any other place.
I think maybe we should just drop it then. And then just allow one outbound configuration, only have one proxy. You can use DNS to handle more than one physical server for redundancy purposes.
Well, before we get that far, there's really two functionalities in RFC 5626. One is the redundant registration failover mechanism.
Yeah.
But the other is connection reuse.
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, you're right.
And it's really, as far as I know, the only well-specified mechanism for connection reuse for SIP for devices that don't have their own, domain name.
Right. Which these wouldn't.
And
especially if you want SIP over TCP over NAT or firewalls, SIP outbound is the only way to get back in an RFC compliant way.
Right.
In Camelio, we actually find the incoming TCP connection and don't give a damn, and we send it out. It also solves a lot of RFC issues with TLS, right? So you don't have to have client certificates or server certificates on client phones.
Well, that sounds good. My own experiences in weird circumstances, the 911 environment, where things like connection redundancy and things like that are much more important. So, but they're unusual. So my experience is probably not relevant to for this application. But the connection reuse and fostering good TCP connections and not having to hack around with NAT traversal and all that's really good stuff. And if we can keep that, I think that would be worthwhile.
Then we can copy a lot of the text from the RFC or SIP over WebSockets, which implements kind of that part of outbound, as Paul mentioned.
Yeah.
I usually call it half outbound because it doesn't require anything special in the proxy, just finding the incoming connection and use that for outbound SIP messages.
I mean,
Well, let's
frankly,
take a crack at that.
the connection, if I recall correctly, I mean, the connection reuse is what drove the development of RFC 5626.
Correct. It did.
Yep.
And that, by the way, is very tightly tied to this requirement we have in the document to only receive requests from the thing you want.
Yeah.
And of course, it's, that's how you identify it. I don't know any reliable way to require to restrict who you receive calls from, in the absence of outbound, 5626.
Yeah, and I don't want to have devices have to accept calls from anybody. That to me, that's a really bad security situation.
Well, like I say, I'm willing to hear, but I don't know of any way that a root could do that reliably other than with 5626.
All right, so can we take this as a working proposal subject to how the words come out and I will try to work with you all and craft words that only require the connection reuse part of outbound RFC and not the registration pieces.
Yeah, and please go back to the zip over WebSockets RFC to find very good examples on how to do that in a standard
How to
text.
do that? Okay, I'll do that.
I think
Brian?
Ali might have
Yes,
something
go
to
ahead.
offer here, because my recollection is that one of the big issues with RFC 5626 is for mobile devices, it's a power sucker.
Yeah.
And-
Keeping two TLS connections, absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah.
even keeping one, isn't it?
Yeah, because carrier closes long-running TCP sections. So that mobile devices is a whole different problem area.
And
Okay.
so,
But
I
also,
think we
you-
fully
you have-
expected that this root spec to be implemented on mobile devices. And so we better not have, better not have a requirement for something that's infeasible to use on mobile devices.
Hey, this is Isaac. On that point, that's definitely one of the concerns we had, is that mobile devices, they all require some type of push notification now to do an inbound call. And we don't have anything for that. So I don't know if I assume we want inbound calls, right? A user
Yes.
would expect that. So it's hard to understand how this would even be usable by anybody without some mechanism for mobile.
Yeah, but when you get a push notification, you open a TCP socket inwards, and you get the invite over that. So we're still using outbound, but we don't have
Well, no, but if you're not already registered, you need some kind of a redirect or something, so that once the client wakes up, and also, how does it get the push notification in the first place, right? You need something like a device token to identify the device.
There is a SIP RFC, there is an RFC on push notifications with SIP. Maybe that needs to be
Yes.
somewhere.
There is. I'll put a reference on the list, unless somebody want to look it up, put it on the thing. But that particular issue has been dealt with for exactly the reason you raised. Multiple people have had exactly that problem, and there is an RFC that deals with it.
There's a lot of implementation experience out there as well. I mean, we have supporting Camellias for handling a lot of that.
Okay.
I know it's my experience, different providers have solved that in different ways. If there's a good RFC or standard that we should follow, then we need to reference that. And I'll agree that that's the way that we're all going to do it.
That's a very good point. I'm surprised we didn't think of it before, but we probably need to bring that in.
Yeah, I haven't followed that closely, but I've seen the 3GPP people talking about it a lot, so I suspect maybe they've got it.
Well, I mean, basically any mobile device for any asynchronous incoming anything, the only way to wake the app up is with a push notification. So if you're going to send it a call, the only way you're going to get the app to get it, if it's asynchronous, is with push.
But you still need SIP outbound to be able to place the outbound invite on the same connection that the phone sets up inbound for registering when it wakes up. So
yes.
it doesn't conflict with outbound. Another problem with the outbound RC that we need to mention is that it implements a pre-forking that was complicated for many SIP implementations. That you have a fork between the different reg IDs for the same contact, and then you handle the next contact in parallel or in serial. We had to fight quite a lot to get that working properly in Camelio, and I wish that before I retired that I actually succeed in testing this.
But that's the registration piece, right? That's the part we said we weren't going to try to get.
Yeah, the redundancy?
Having multiple links with multiple reg IDs for the same registration. That was kind of complex.
Yeah.
History, sorry.
Okay.
So Ollie, let me ask a clarifying question. Are you saying that people are using the push features, so they're not registered all the time? They're waiting until they get the push, and then they register using RFC 5626?
Or
That's one way to do it.
But we implemented in many places push notifications. In Camelio, what we basically have to do is a way to freeze the SIP transaction while the push is taking place, and we're waiting for an incoming registration. When we have an incoming registration, we forward the invite quickly, as quick as possible.
There does not need to be a connection between registration and that push notification. You can do regular registration without it, but you have to make sure that the client is doing refreshing and all that stuff. Because
you have to have an authenticated connection to the phone, and that's usually a registration that comes in, right?
Isaac?
Mobile, the app doesn't get woken up unless there's a call or the user activates the app, right? So there's no refresh. And this is all fairly recent in the last few years. I mean,
yes, that's right.
Apple used to allow you to run the app in the background and stay registered. And then they allowed the VoIP connection, which allowed you to wake the app up with the TCP connection. But more recently, they've completely shut that down. The app cannot run at all unless it gets a push.
Yeah.
And so,
It's either the carrier or the phone manufacturer. Carriers also close connections in various ways with middle boxes.
All right, let's unless somebody has some new aspect of this they want to discuss, I think I know how to go forward. I may call on folks for help in reviewing text to make sure that I'm doing something, but I think I know what we're going to do. And so I'd like to move on so we have time for other issues at the end, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, OAuth. This has been discussed several times. We haven't got any text. We need to decide if we're supporting OAuth, and if so, for what. We could support OAuth for authentication for the configuration info. We could support OAuth for authentication for SIP, or we could do both. And if we do have a role for OAuth, is that instead of or in addition to username password for any of those possibilities? So I'd like to settle this. It's been discussed on and off, and I don't care. I like it, but I also know it hasn't been implemented very widely. Now that's less true of any HTTP-based thing than a SIP-based thing, but still, what do people want to do?
Hey, this is Isaac. Maybe if you could help me understand at least what we were thinking with OAuth. Would it be, the way OAuth normally works, right, is I sign up for an account and it says, oh, you can choose something else to log in, Facebook, Google, Apple, whatever. Would it be like that, where then every provider would have to provide their own OAuth service/server? That's the only way I think it could work, because
Yes, that's
there
correct.
seemed to be the idea that there would somehow be a single OAuth that would somehow know everybody's passwords and username, and that
Right.
seems like a
No,
security
no, no,
issue.
no. It would be every provider provides their own. It would be an alternative to having configured username passwords that are used in, directly with register and with any of the authentication mechanisms that you use with SIP or with the configuration service.
Yeah.
The username password is there. I do remind you that OAuth ultimately uses a username password. It's just that there's then tokens, and tokens can be shared and used and can be minted and then used subsequently and things like that. So,
Brian,
what do you want to do?
In addition, OAuth can use, multi-factor login. You can have tokens.
Yes.
You can have. We don't limit what OAuth does. Doesn't have to be username password. Could be TLS client certificates. We don't do that.
I guess that's a good point. It lets you do other ways, tokens, especially.
If we say OAuth, we let someone else decide that part. What we get out, what you said, the tokens, right?
Yeah.
We get an Oauth token, an identity token if it's OpenID Connect, and what's the name of the third one? A refresh token. But the thing is, SIP has been around for a very long time. When SIP was created, the best authentication we had was HTTP, basic digest auth, with MD5 hash method. We're now in 2021 and we're setting new standards. MD5 is considered broken since a long time. In the SIP standards, we have two different options at least. We have one RC that have replaced MD5 with stronger hash algorithms, right? That will possibly die in 10 years or 5 years or whatever, depending on CPU and other things. We also have first document that I think is not fully done, but that's probably just me. That explains how to take these kind of tokens in a SIP world and use them for authentication. And I think leaving MD5 is important for a new standard with the importance we have. These calls are important and need all kind of protection they need, can have. OAuth adds complexity. It's easier for people with web experience to handle. It's harder for people with SIP experience to handle because it's a crazy monster that doesn't look like MD5. But it gives us a lot of more possibilities. So you authenticate somewhere else in a UI. There are ways to do this without UIs, with just tokens of some kind or other things. But the result is we get tokens that the SIP server verifies with an identity server that they're valid. And if we have trust between the OAuth IDP and the SIP server, we're all ready to go.
This is Isaac. So I think my understanding, though, is that so for OAuth to really work, you need a web browser, right?
No, not really. There are standards for IoT without any user interfaces at all. And there are many different setups. But the most common one is, like you said, Facebook login or Google login. But that's just one way of using it.
But how do I know I'm really connected to Google? right? I thought the way it worked is I can see the certificate in my browser. I can see I've got a green lock. I can see I'm connected to google.com. And I know I'm not sending my password to Brian Rosen's man in the middle server.
Well, now you're opening up a whole long discussion about the web of trust, and we can discuss that for hours. It won't help this working group. But skip Facebook and Google login and say, like Brian said earlier, I mean, each service provider has their own identity.
That's how it works, though, right? That's how it works. I trust Google. I trust that Google is not going to compromise my password. So that's kind of the whole basis, right? I know I'm talking to Google. I trust Google. I give them my password, right? So I think in our service, I trust Sorensen as a BRS provider. I can see and verify that I'm really talking to their server. So we can go on this forever. But I think Oauth is a nice option. But if you were going to say something like, well, all the providers now have to implement an Oauth server, that's going to open a whole can of worms. Like we're just starting to touch the surface of things that would have to be solved as far as how that would be done from the RU in a way that would ensure that the user's password is not compromised.
So I hear in that you might be okay with in addition to, but you're not in favor of instead of existing authentication.
Yeah, I think it would put too much of a burden, and there are just a bunch of things we'd have to solve if we were going to make it the only option or the required option. Yes. So as optional, okay, but not as the only required method.
Right. Okay.
I think the first decision is whether or not we recommend MD5, and I would say not. And then we have the option of using the stronger authentication in, I don't remember the RC, maybe Paul.
Yeah.
With SSH 256 or 512, right?
Okay, so that's a separate issue. I just want to push that off just for a second, and just stay on OAuth just for now, Ollie.
Okay.
What are you? If we said in addition to, is that? Well, let me ask this. You've been very vocal that you think it's the right thing to do. Is there someone else on the call? And we will bring this to the list. So this is not the definitive word. But if there's someone else in the meeting who believes that it is appropriate to require every implementation of the RU device to support OAuth as an alternative authentication mechanism instead of the existing SIP mechanisms, and presumably for the config info, the HTTP mechanisms. Is there someone else besides Ollie who thinks we ought to have that as at least an option?
Brian?
Yeah.
There's a little muddle here, I think, maybe, is whether we're requiring this on the RU or we're requiring it on the provider.
I think the way it would have to be is a mandatory at the device and optional at the provider.
Yes. Thank you for that clarification.
Well, so I'm now looking, is there someone else who thinks that that's a reasonable, that's what they want to do? They want to have OAuth implemented on all devices and optional at the provider to use with the existing SIP and HTTP mechanisms mandatory, basically both ways, right? You can choose to use only OAuth, you can choose to use only username, password.
Is there
the RU implements both
at this point?
I'm sorry?
Is there a definition for OAuth for SIP at this point? I was Googling it and I found
no.
an individual never went.
There's a draft. There isn't an RFC.
There's an RFC. There's definitely an RFC
really?
written by Refat. Yeah,
okay.
I was surprised when it reached RFC status. That's why I know it.
So
I saw the-
Al,
can you-
are you aware of it being implemented anywhere?
Haven't seen any implementations, like I said earlier, because
Oh.
no customers require it, but don't find it too hard to make implementations of it.
So it just seems to me that there's no one else on the call, and again, we will bring this to the list, that supports it. And although I like it, I think it's a great idea, I don't see anyone saying they want to be forced to implement it on the ruse side. And unless there's more than you who wants it, I think we're in the rough consensus saying we don't. But again, I'm inclined to allow it, but I don't want to do that unless there's somebody who thinks it's worth doing besides you, and because it's work, right? At least the device implementer has to go and do all the work, and unless there's some hint.
Please, if you don't do Oauth, please don't accept MD5.
Okay.
Right?
So now I think we've settled the Oauth issue. I'm going to go to the list on this. But the other issue you raised is an important one, and I hope that the folks on the call will speak up. But as if you know anything about crypto, MD5 is an algorithm that has been broken. It's just too easy to crack. And up to, I can't remember the number, but there's a relatively recent RFC that substitutes SHA-256 for MD5 in basic, in authentication for SIP. Yeah, in digest. I would like to require that. I don't think we should support MD5. What do other people think? Silence. Isaac, thank you for speaking up. Gene, think about this one.
I'm checking with the team, but I think we currently use MD5.
You probably do, and you're insecure by a lot. Well, would you research that? It's really not good to be supporting MD5 in anything these days. It's not quite as bad in a phone than it is in other things, but it is crackable. It's pretty easy to break in, and I would rather not support it. It really has been a long time since MD5 was insecure.
And as I understand it, 8760 is basically just drop in the new algorithm and you're done.
Correct. It's just drop in SHA-256. There's no difference other than that. It's literally substitute.
So we want to be more
There's
secure.
a bit more. Sorry.
I'm open to making things more secure. I just need to understand what that transition would look like.
Okay.
The problem with that RFC is that it also implements a negotiation method that can lead to interesting downgrading attacks. It opens up not for a single hash algorithm, but for multiple, and a negotiation that is rather complex. We've been testing this at something called OpenSIP last year, and we're gonna continue testing it to get implementation experience. So you have to be careful. It's not just a replacement with a single hash algorithm. It's multiple hash algorithm and a negotiation. So we have to be pretty clear with the implementation guidelines for this to work. So if you say in the RUM RC that you only allow a single hash algorithm, you're avoiding from that RC, you're avoiding the negotiation and downgrade attack problems.
So we recommend something better as like desired, but MD5 is still allowed, maybe something like that where we can create a path to.
Well, you need a transition issue path. So I think that's probably right, but you want a drop dead date. You want and I don't think that we could put a date in the RFC, so I'm not talking about that, but you want to, yes, you need transition because you can't upgrade everything instantly, but you really do want to get rid of MD5. It's really insecure at this point, really, seriously.
Does that mean that the language should just be more of an implementation should? I mean, isn't that what it should implies?
Well, the way I think you end up having to say it, and Ollie doesn't like this because you can get the downgrade attack, which is the part that you really don't want to do. But in order to make a reasonable transition, I think you'll have to use the negotiation mechanism, and you'll have to allow MD5 for at least some period of time. And then after that, you probably want to reject it.
You add a lot of complexity that way. I think it would be, there are easier solutions, but
I mean, to
another
what extent
discussion.
To what extent are RUs going to be greenfield as opposed to existing deployed base? If they're greenfield, you can just say only ever do Chapter 256 done, right?
On the RU side, yes. On the provider side, no.
Yeah, the thing is, the provider's got a shitload of devices out in the field. You know, they aren't root compatible, but you know that, you know, when they start supporting the RU, they're still going to have to support their old devices for some period of time. And if those devices, you know, authenticate using MD5, their accounts at least have to support that, you know.
I mean, we can say that the RU device shall only support 256, but then you've got an instantaneous, you know, you couldn't support it on the provider side until they allowed it in the option. They would have to have it optional for their old devices, period. I mean, that would just, period, be true. But for RU devices, as long as they can support it, the RU could be 256 only. We can talk about that. I think that's a somewhat separate issue. What does the RU device do versus what does the provider do? The providers have to be able to accept MD5. The question of does the RU have to generate it?
But does the provider have to have all of them in the same SIP domain? You can have different policies for different SIP domain. So you can have legacy MD5 compatible in one SIP domain and one SIP domain that requires SHA-256 for the RU devices. So there are migration strategies that actually work properly.
Okay.
But one has to help people with proposing different ways of doing this from the server side.
All right. Again, I'll take a crack. If we're okay with it, I'll take a crack at wording, and then we'll see where we are.
Thank you.
Isaac, did you have something else?
No, well, I was just wondering if we needed to add something to the configuration service to indicate, and I don't know.
That's an interesting thought. That's a real interesting thought.
Otherwise, how would the client know? Oh, this provider doesn't.
Well, the RFC has a negotiation mechanism. It may be only.
Okay, I wasn't sure about that, so that.
Yeah, okay. That's and Ollie doesn't want to have to implement it because it's more complicated.
You get challenges, and in the challenge, the server says which hash mechanism.
Right.
You can use, and if the server supports multiple hash mechanisms, you get multiple challenges.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take a crack at some words, and we'll raise it on the list and see where we are. But I think that's the way we're heading. Is support 256 must support 256 on the RU device with a transition mechanism for providers to ease over. All right, now what have I forgotten? What have we not talked about that people believe are still open items?
Hey, this is Isaac. So a big one in my mind is IPv6. It seemed that just got added fairly in one of the most recent updates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then there was a comment that was something to the extent of, well, it's no big deal. You just put the client behind a gateway. So we don't, it's no big deal. We could just say the RU is going to support IPv6. And I'm not sure it's quite that simple. And I also wonder if this document really only covers the inner. So the comment was basically, hey, you put it behind a gateway, and I'll turn my camera on for a bit. You put it behind a gateway, like a NAT64 gateway, I assume. And
well, I mean, at least the way I know people do this is the SBC does it. Because it's a B2B UA, and it doesn't really matter what happens on the inside of the network, and it only matters what happens on the outside of the network. And as long as the SBC can B2B UA on an IPv6 address with media, you're set.
The problem isn't IPv6 or IPv4. The problem arises when you have dual stacks. And we've written a set of RCs, we updated SIP Connect, and we've written a lot of documents around that. So dual stack is the real killer, where we get SIP signaling on IPv4 and we get the media offer with IPv6 and you're screwed, right?
So I'm not sure that's correct because so iOS today, we're already IPv6, right? Apple requires that providers only do IPv6 now.
Yes.
So they provide the NAT64 gateway. It's not the provider that's doing the NAT64 gateway. They do it. But there are some things that we had to solve, like for example, in the SDP, you use IP literals, right? But you can't really start shoving IPv6 addresses in your SDP without. Well, you can, but if the other providers aren't doing it, then your SDP doesn't work, right? Well, let's say you're doing a call with an IPv4 client on desktop. Well, what the heck is it going to do with the IPv6 address in your SDP? Or you just have like 300 candidates, and your SDP is like 1 megabyte. Right? So. So I don't mean to try to get into solving all those issues, but I think at the very least we need to clarify that the interface to the provider is IPv4. Or I just really wonder if IPv6 is important. It's another thing you just have to do it on mobile, right?
You just have to, right? It's getting right, and it's getting that way in other networks, although they're not hitting consumers yet, but they're gonna pretty soon. And
but so there are some things. So there are some things out there like that. Like there's a well-known prefix you can use to know. Oh, okay, this is really an IPv4 address that's been converted to IPv6, and then the client knows. Oh, okay, I just need to convert this back to IPv4. And that's what it uses in the SDP, and then the other side knows, oh, okay. And there's some issues with DNS64, right? And what DNS64 does is the IPv6 client gets an IPv6 address, even though there really isn't one on the server, right? And that's what's used for the NAT64 gateway. So I can go on, right? There's just all these things that you at least need to think through and solve.
Tell you what, Isaac, it sounds like you've got a lot to contribute here. Can you indeed go on the mailing list?
Yeah. Well, I have a limited number of hours in the day, but right? But I think there's just there's a whole bunch of things we got to solve or at the very least we say, look, the providers are still IPv4. And, you're going to have this gateway, but there's, a big one is like the public IP address. We need a public IP address for for our CDRs, for the FCC billing. And so we can't, I don't know that we can submit an IPv6 address. That would be something we might need to clarify with the FCC.
Yeah, that I can get fixed for you if it's not. If it's not acceptable now, I can make it be acceptable in a very short period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think we either need to take it out or we need to solve these things. And at the very least, there's a high level of, well, yeah, you're going to use a NAT64 and you're going to have to know when an IPv6 address is really IPv4. And there's the well-known prefixes. And although like the carriers aren't doing it the way they're supposed to do it, right? They aren't using the well-known prefix. So T-Mobile, I think, uses a prefix with like 2600, and every once in a while they'll start using a new one, and then we're like, oh crap, we got to rush out a fix. So it would be great if somebody could solve that for us, right? But we've had to kind of jump through some hoops and do some things that aren't in an RFC or a standard anywhere. So I think and I'm just giving you a few examples, but those are the things that we would need to really work to.
Obviously, we're trying to create an RFC here, so
Yeah.
So we need to cover all that stuff that isn't in one yet.
We're running out of time. Sorry, we are running out of
dual stack.
I think we are out of time.
We are out of time. I just want to, if I can indulge you a little bit. Is anyone else got an issue that has not, if anyone else has an issue that has not been discussed, put it on the list, please, so that we know that people still think there's things to do. It's real important that we understand what we need to do because we really are trying to finish. We clearly are going to need another rev or two. And there'll be some list discussion to try and figure out some of these issues like the IPv6 issue and the other stuff that we've talked about. But I really do appreciate, go ahead.
Just really quick, do you want, I think before you indicated you wanted a separate email thread for each issue. Is that still the case? So let's say we have three or four issues.
I would prefer, no. We're far enough along that I don't think that we care that much now. So if you got 3 or 4 issues, put them in one email. I'll deal with them individually. That multiple people have done that, so I'm used to it now. Go ahead and start any number of threads you want.
Maybe we could start a thread for each one after that, or something like that.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Right. Okay.
Fine. Yeah. So put a list out if you've got a list.
Whatever works best for you.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. Yeah. I want to have it sooner. And so don't do do whatever works for you and we'll deal with it. Anything else? Okay. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Great meeting. I'll keep working on revs and we'll see if we can get this thing done pretty soon. Thank you.
I guess at the next meeting, we better ask for more time.
Yeah, I guess we will.
The notes are in the CodeMD, so.
Thank you.
Hopefully, I've more or less transcribed, so hopefully you can get something meaningful work items out of it.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Sure.
Bye.
Bye.